Hey guys, keep watching this video to learn exactly what it takes to start your own podcast. I've had my own podcast up and running for over a year now, and for me, it's been quite an interesting journey because I realized there were some benefits of having a podcast that I didn't even think of originally. So I'm just gonna walk you through the first few steps that you need to take to start a podcast, and then of course, with consistency, you can make it something very, very successful. So first of all, what I had to do was come up with what my theme was going to be. So basically, I'm thinking to myself, okay, if I'm going to start a podcast, I want it to be something that I am passionate about, because one thing about having a podcast is that you have to be consistent, right? So if you're thinking from like the consistency point of view, you want to make sure that it's something that you can do year in and year out. This is not like a 2-week project. This is not a half a year type of thing, not even 1 year. This is something that you're going to do long term. At least that's what I would advise. I would advise definitely planning for the long term, because that's when you can experience real growth. Sometimes it takes a year or two of content until it really starts getting some traction. As you're going down that journey, you want to make sure that it's something that isn't just exciting in the moment. Maybe something that's just a quick flash in the pan, something that's going viral. You don't want to hinge your whole podcast around that. You want to hinge it on something that is very interesting to you, and most importantly, you are passionate about. Because even if it's an off day, you're feeling a little down, or you're tired, or you're busy with other things, this is something that makes you so passionate that you're going to be excited about doing it, because that's what it takes to succeed in the long run. So choose something that you're passionate about, number one. Number two, you're going to have to select a name for your podcast. Think of it like this. There's kind of a couple things to consider here. Number one, you could just make it your name. Let's say your name is Frank. You could call it The Frank Show, right? Or something along those lines, something to do with your name. But the only issue with that is that if you ever decide to sell your show, let's say your show just like totally blows up, you decide to sell it, you're kind of selling yourself with the show. Does that make sense? It's not really a standalone show. Now, it might be easier to build the brand. Let's say you already have a big brand and you have a lot of followers and stuff like that. It might be a little bit easier to leverage that personal brand to grow this as well. But if you want it to grow completely separate from you, and maybe you could even hand it off to somebody in the future, you want to make sure that it's something that's not tied to your personal brand so directly. You could go the personal name route, or you could just call it something like Business Talks or something like that. And so in that scenario, you have something that's separate from your personal brand, and it could be given to the next generation. You could hire a CEO to run it. You could hire people to run the show for you. Think of like Fox News or CNN. These are all platforms, right? So it's a big network that's been created. It's not going to be the person that started the show or the platform or the network. It's going to be people that they've hired to be anchors, or people who have their own show on this network. It's ideal to create something like that, because that way you have longevity. Although it might be a little bit more difficult to build that out. Once you have all of that figured out, the next thing you're going to need is some sort of filming location. So for some people, it makes sense to just rent a studio. I currently just rent studios, to be honest. I haven't built my own studio for this. I'm looking into potentially doing that in the future, but keep in mind, it's actually quite expensive to build a really, really nice studio, especially if you're thinking about somewhere that's central. Now, if you don't live somewhere that's central, it's probably not an ideal option for you. For example, I live in Seattle. And so for me, if I build a studio in Seattle, there aren't that many people that I want to interview in Seattle. So it probably wouldn't make too much sense. However, if people are willing to fly into Seattle and I can convince them to fly in here for the show, because of the mutual benefit that it's going to provide, I think that it might be worth building some sort of small studio. If you go to somewhere like Vegas or New York City or Miami, or somewhere that's a hotspot for a lot of people that you might want to interview for your podcast, it might make sense for you to build a studio there. Because think about it like this. There are studios that literally cost $1,000 or more per hour of filming. If you can kind of get a ballpark estimate of what it's going to cost you to build a studio, you could probably get away with building something not that expensive. But keep in mind, if you want it to be a really, really nice studio, that's going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions. As far as building your own studio is probably a little bit later down the line. I would make sure you have some sort of success with your podcast before you do that. So I think the right way to do it is to start renting studios. And guys, there are studios that will rent out for like $100, $200, $300 an hour, and they're nice studios. And the cool thing about it is that you don't have to purchase any equipment. There's no like long-term commitment or anything like that. People will just rent out a studio that they've built, and they will come in there and they'll oftentimes operate your cameras, your audio, all that stuff. So you don't even have to worry about it. You just get a nice complete file at the end of your interview. And then of course you hand it off to your editors and you have them posted and stuff like that. So that's the next part of it. And then after that, after you've found the studio, now it's time to think, okay, if your studio is in Dallas, Texas, okay, cool. So let me think about who I know locally in Dallas, Texas, just to get the ball rolling. Now, of course, you can have people fly in if you want, but I would start with your warm circle of influence. So you want people who you know personally, who you have a good relationship with, who you think are going to be valuable guests on this podcast, and just start inviting them. The way that I prefer to do it is I do a lot of interviews in one day. So I try to stack up as many as I possibly can. I think the most I ever did was 7 or 8 in one day. And so it's a long day, but if you're posting weekly, that's 2 months worth of content that I filmed in one day. So I'm not having to go out to the studio every week or every 2 weeks. So keep in mind that in order for this to be sustainable, you have to kind of film in bulk, even if you do it on a weekly basis. If you're filming every week and you do, let's say 3 or 4 interviews a week, that gives you just a ton of content, because that's a month's worth of content. You would have to film for a couple months. If you did it once a week, you'd film for like 2 or 3 months and you'd be done for the whole year. So keep in mind, that's also a potential strategy. So start thinking about who you could possibly have on your podcast, who potential guests might be, and then start inviting them, get the ball rolling. Then once you have a couple episodes, then you can start reaching out to a cold audience. These are people who might not know you at all, but you have a podcast link to share with them. It's like, hey, I wanted to have you as a guest on my podcast. Here's a link to check out a recent episode we did. I think you'd be a great fit. I love what you do. And so you start interviewing these people who you admire or you think would be valuable guests for the podcast, but you don't even know them. So once you've built up that proof, that track record, you can share it with them and also get them to come on your podcast and share their valuable insights with your audience. So that is how I would build a podcast, starting from scratch, starting from nothing. It really does not take that much. There's just a couple pieces that you have to strategically in place, and then just make sure you're consistent with it. It's really not that difficult. A lot of it is mostly arranging guests. So once you've run out of all the people that you know, now it's time to get your critical thinking cap on and start thinking about who else would be a good guest for this podcast and start inviting them. Alrighty guys, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next video.